Berlin Brandenburg Airport is a monument to modern European efficiency and security. It is a place of transit and routine. On July 16, 2025, thousands of passengers moved through its sprawling terminals, drinking overpriced coffee and checking their phones, entirely unaware that a monster was walking among them. He was a 47-year-old man, reportedly attempting to board a routine flight to Tunis, blending seamlessly into the flow of international travelers. To the casual observer or the weary customs agent, he was just another face in the crowd. But to thousands of men, women, and children trapped in a living hell across the Mediterranean Sea, this man possessed a much darker title. They knew him as the Angel of Death. The arrest was swift and quiet. Acting on a sealed warrant issued just days prior by the International Criminal Court in The Hague, German authorities quietly detained the man. His true name is Khaled Mohamed Ali al-Hishri, and his apprehension marked a seismic shift in global justice. It was the first time in 15 years that a Libyan suspect had been taken into custody for atrocities committed during the country's endless and bleeding civil war. Khaled al-Hishri was not some sort of rogue serial killer operating in the shadows, and nor was he a lone psychopath. He was something much more terrifying. He was more like a state-sponsored architect of human suffering. As a senior commander of a highly organized, heavily armed militia, he served as the overlord of the Mitiga Prison complex in Tripoli, a black site of unimaginable industrialized horror. For over half a decade, from 2014 to 2020, al-Hishri oversaw a sprawling system of torture, rampant sexual violence, modern-day enslavement, and murder. This was not a prison designed for rehabilitation or even basic incarceration. It seems as though it was an ecosystem explicitly engineered to destroy the human body and to shatter the human mind. This is the definitive story of a system designed to weaponize agony, the man who perfected its brutal mechanics, and the long, agonizing 15-year road to finally dragging him into the light of international law. To comprehend how a man like Khaled al-Hishri could wield such absolute unchecked power, one must first understand the catastrophic geopolitical landscape of post-2011 Libya. The violent overthrow of dictator Muammar Gaddafi did not usher in a golden era of peaceful democracy. Instead, it tore the country apart and created a massive chaotic vacuum of power. The state collapsed, institutions dissolved. In the capital city of Tripoli, basic security and governance were not provided by a traditional accountable police force, but instead it was provided by shifting alliance of heavily armed militias. Among these groups, one emerged as the most dominant, the most feared. They were known as the Special Deterrence Force, or RADA. Led by a powerful commander named Abdal Rauf Kara, RADA initially presented itself as an anti-Gaddafi revolutionary force. But as the dust settled, they rapidly morphed into an ultra-conservative, highly autonomous paramilitary syndicate. Through sheer firepower and unhesitating brutality, RADA seized control of strategic assets across the entire capital. The crown jewel of their newly conquered empire was the Mitiga compound. This was a massive expanse of land on the eastern edge of Tripoli. It contained the militia's sprawling headquarters, the capital's only functioning international airport, and a highly secretive, heavily fortified prison complex. In 2015, the internationally recognized government of Libya, the Government of National Accord, made a fatal, desperate compromise. In a bid to project stability, the government officially integrated the RADA militia into the state apparatus, assigning them formal law enforcement duties under the Ministry of the Interior. It was a disastrous deal. The militia was given state salaries and a veneer of absolute legal legitimacy, but in reality, they answered to no one. The Libyan government had effectively handed the keys of the justice system over to a syndicate of warlords. Deep within the walls of this fortified kingdom, Khaled el-Hishri rose to terrifying prominence. Operating under the aliases al-Bouti or Sheikh Khaled, el-Hishri became a founding member of RADA and a senior commanding official within Mitiga Prison. From 2014 to 2020, he held general unquestioned authority over the facility alongside prison director Osama Najim. El-Hishri acted with complete impunity, openly defying orders from the actual Libyan Attorney General to release innocent prisoners. Instead of enforcing the law, el-Hishri transformed Mitiga into an assembly line of atrocities, answerable only to the militia's brutal hierarchy. The horror of the Mitiga prison began long before an inmate ever reached a cell. The arrests carried out by RADA forces across Tripoli were wildly arbitrary, violently executed, and entirely disconnected from any legitimate legal process. The victims dragged into the compound were rarely combatants. They were overwhelmingly civilians. Anyone could be taken. RADA abducted political opponents, human rights activists, journalists, and vulnerable migrants. They kidnapped people whose religious, social, or political views conflicted with the militia's extreme ultra-conservative ideology. Frequently, the motive was pure greed. People were abducted simply because the militia wanted their private property, their land, their money, or the ransom their families could provide. Many of the victims were locked away in darkness for years without ever being told why they had been taken.
The actions of Mr. Khaled el-Hishri and the RADA militia are not the actions of a legitimate law enforcement agency, and Mitiga was not a normal prison.
Between 2014 and 2020, at least 5,140 people were violently detained and systematically mistreated in the facility. The physical conditions inside Mitiga were not a byproduct of poor funding, but they were meticulously engineered to degrade, humiliate, and destroy the human body. Survivors who made it out alive described holding cells that were unimaginably crowded. Detainees were packed so tightly together that they could not sit down or lie flat on their backs. Witnesses testified to the International Criminal Court that they were forced to sleep on their sides, pressed intimately against the sweaty, starving bodies of strangers in what they described as an excruciating knife position, just to fit inside the room. When sleep finally came, it had to be taken in shifts. The air was suffocating and reeked of human waste and death. For those the militia wished to break completely, extreme isolation was utilized. Victims were locked inside suffocating metal boxes left out in the freezing winter, or thrown into solitary confinement cells so microscopic they could barely move a single limb, resulting in severe or permanent muscle atrophy. The deprivation of basic human needs was absolute. Starvation was actively weaponized to induce compliance. Horrific, untreated injuries from daily torture sessions festered in the dark. But perhaps the most horrifying revelation presented by the prosecutors was the calculated use of biological terror. Highly contagious diseases like tuberculosis and HIV ran rampant through the unsanitary cells. According to devastating evidence compiled by the prosecutors, the prison leadership intentionally weaponized these illnesses. They deliberately placed healthy detainees whom they wanted to punish into specific, heavily infected cells. This guaranteed they would contract the lethal diseases. Presiding over this kingdom of squalor was Khaled el-Hishri. He was a deeply hands-on operator of the torture machine. The prosecution charges that he personally tortured, enslaved, sexually assaulted, and murdered at least 159 detainees with his own hands. El-Hishri was infamous among the prisoners for his extreme sadism, earning him the terrifying moniker, the Angel of Death. He took immense pleasure in the physical destruction of his captives. The ICC prosecutors detailed how he routinely removed detainees from their holding cells and dragged them to notorious blood-soaked interrogation sites within the compound known as the Nakliya, an Islamic neighborhood, where the most extreme violence was carried out. His cruelty was so absolute that he actively prevented his own guards from showing even a fraction of mercy. In one verified account read to the court, a guard attempted to show a shred of humanity by asking to allow the suffocating detainees outside for a brief moment of exercise. El-Hishri immediately intervened, reprimanding the guard with a statement that perfectly encapsulated the core philosophy of Mitiga Prison. He stated, "What are you doing? You are trying to help them. We are trying to make them die." While the general population of the prison suffered immensely, a specific, highly targeted, and deeply psychological reign of terror occurred in the women's section. This was a department over which Khaled al-Hishri exercised absolute, direct control. Al-Hishri and his Rada militiamen used the prison to violently enforce their own draconian moral code on the civilian population. Women and girls were routinely abducted from the streets for behaviors the militia deemed inappropriate for their gender. The justifications were absurdly broad: simply working as a professional journalist, being a singer, posting opinions on social media, being seen at a public beach, or being perceived by a militiaman as acting manly was enough to warrant violent abduction and indefinite imprisonment. Men and boys who were perceived as gay or simply deemed effeminate were similarly targeted, dragged into the facility and subjected to horrific targeted abuse based entirely on their perceived sexual orientation and gender expression. Inside the women's section, the abuse was relentless and heavily sexualized. Al-Hishri was directly witnessed dragging blindfolded and bound female detainees across the rough concrete floors by a rope, violently beating them with implements as he pulled them like animals through the prison corridors. These detainees were entirely at his mercy. They were subjected to rape and forced nudity, crimes explicitly designed to permanently destroy a woman's standing in conservative Libyan society. The torture was a psychological weapon. One female survivor provided a harrowing testimony of her interrogation to the ICC. She described how her captors cursed her, degraded her, and violently ripped her veil from her head. She testified to the court, "In my culture, it is the end of a woman's life if a man takes off her veil against her will." It showed that they could do anything they wanted with a female prisoner. I felt completely powerless and vulnerable. I felt like everything was over. As Sarah Pellet, the victim's representative, said, "Imprisoning a woman is enough in and of itself to produce deep and long-lasting stigma, causing them to feel they'd lost their honor, their family status, and in some cases their future." Legal representatives explained to the court that the trauma inflicted by al-Hishri was designed to be a permanent societal death sentence. For these survivors, the physical scars were accompanied by the devastating reality that the trauma lives on in their bodies, in their mental health, in their ability to conceive children, and in the way they are forever viewed by their own families and communities. The unimaginable horrors of Mitiga were not reserved solely for Libyans. The prison became a central, highly profitable node in a massive internationally subsidized machine of human exploitation. For years, the European Union has poured millions of euros into funding, training, and equipping the Libyan Coast Guard. There is one singular objective as to why this happens: to intercept migrants and refugees attempting to cross the Mediterranean Sea before they can reach European shores. Under this controversial policy, thousands of desperate people fleeing war and famine are captured at sea and forcibly returned to Libya. But once they returned, they do not find sanctuary. They find the militias instead. Countless sub-Saharan African immigrants were funneled directly into Khaled al-Hishri's domain. There, any pretense of state law enforcement vanished entirely. According to the ICC's principal counsel for victims, the prison operated a literal system of modern-day slavery, where the militia exercised power akin to ownership over human beings.
Does not apply to us. I'm here today in this parliament, not only bringing the stories from Libya, but bringing the reality which I had to live on my body, which I had to witness.
David Yambio is a survivor of this exact pipeline. After attempting to flee to Europe in search of safety, he was intercepted by the Coast Guard and eventually locked inside Mitiga. According to devastating testimonies from Yambio and other African migrants, they were systematically stripped of their names, their identities, and their humanity. They testified that their captors referred to them exclusively as slaves. These enslaved migrants were forced into brutal, back-breaking manual labor. Yambio recounted being forced to construct a new prison building to hold even more victims, and being ordered to load heavy military weaponry and ammunition onto Rada militia trucks. The punishment for showing exhaustion or simply working too slowly due to extreme starvation and dehydration was cruel. Yambio described being whipped relentlessly by al-Hishri and his subordinates with heavy industrial water pipes. Guards wielding AK-47 assault rifles would viciously beat the forced laborers at the slightest provocation and sometimes purely for their own sadistic entertainment. In some of the most shocking cases presented to the ICC, it was revealed that these captive African migrants were even forced out of the prison and pushed onto the front lines to take part in active military hostilities, used as expendable cannon fodder during violent clashes between rival armed groups. For years, the international community looked away from this nightmare. The militias were deemed too entrenched to fight, and the desperate European desire to stem the flow of African migration heavily outweighed the horrifying human rights violations occurring in Libya. Even when the international arrest warrants were finally issued by the ICC, justice remained agonizingly elusive. To truly understand the absolute miracle of Khaled al-Hishri's arrest in Germany, one must first look at the tragic, politically motivated failure of a parallel case in Italy. In early 2025, Italian authorities successfully arrested Osama Njim, the actual director of Mitiga Prison, a direct subordinate of the Rada leadership and one of al-Hishri's primary co-perpetrators. Njim was also explicitly wanted by the ICC. Survivors living in Europe, including David Yambio, celebrated. They believed the untouchable architecture of their torture was finally collapsing. But the hope was violently short-lived. Bowing to intense geopolitical pressure and exploiting convenient legal technicalities, the Italian government released Njim shortly after his arrest. They put the wanted war criminal on a government jet and flew him straight back to Libya, effectively returning a mass torturer to his fortified stronghold. The Italian failure casts a long, dark shadow over the victims. The Libyan militias were emboldened, operating under the belief that they were untouchable and they were protected by diplomatic passports and immense wealth. That is exactly why the events of July 16, 2025 in Berlin were so monumentally important. When Khaled al-Hishri landed in Germany, reportedly seeking specialized medical treatment for a family member, the German federal police did not hesitate or bow to political pressure. They executed the sealed ICC warrant, detained the angel of death on the tarmac, and flatly refused to let him go. By December of that year, after meticulously processing the domestic legal requirements, German authorities loaded al-Hishri onto a secure flight and handed him over to the custody of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. The shield of impunity had finally been pierced. This was monumental, considering it took an agonizing 15 years from the initial 2011 United Nations Security Council referral for a Libyan suspect to finally sit in the docket of the International Criminal Court. In May 2026, the confirmation of charges hearings began. Khaled al-Hishri sat in the courtroom, physically present before the world. Observers in the gallery noted that he sat perfectly straight, entirely emotionless, staring blankly ahead as the deputy prosecutor detailed the sadistic destruction of thousands of human lives. The prosecution laid out a devastating ironclad case. They utilized written submissions from victims, direct statements from 63 courageous witnesses, official militia decrees, and mountains of documentary evidence. They charged him with 17 distinct counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The defense pushed back aggressively, attempting to dismantle the court's authority. Al-Hishri's lawyers, Ian Edwards and Yasser Hassan, argued that the ICC possessed no legal jurisdiction, claiming that the Libyan state's 2025 agreement accepting the court's authority was legally void. They claimed that the prosecution relied on hidden witnesses and shockingly argued that the brutal, deadly treatment in Mitiga was merely a legitimate law enforcement operation. On July 16, 2026, exactly 1 year to the day after his surprise arrest in Berlin, the panel of 3 pretrial judges unanimously and decisively rejected the defense's arguments. They confirmed all 17 charges, establishing that there were substantial grounds to believe that al-Hishri was a central, willing architect of the horrors at Mitiga. The judges officially ordered the case to proceed to a full trial. The upcoming trial of Khaled Mohamed Ali al-Hishri will test whether international law can truly hold brutal perpetrators accountable. The grim reality is that RADA still controls the Mitiga compound today. The arbitrary arrests, the forced disappearances, continue unabated. Other warlords, militia commanders, they still walk free, and they're shielded by systemic state corruption and the hypocritical nature of European migration deals. The structural dynamics that allowed Hishri to thrive remain largely intact. The trial in The Hague cannot immediately dismantle the Libyan militia state. It cannot turn back time, and it cannot erase the profound physical scars and psychological devastation borne by thousands of men and women who miraculously survived the angel of death. But it does something equally vital. It shatters the myth of absolute impunity. It proves that even those who hide behind high walls, state salaries, global geopolitical apathy, they can all eventually be brought into the unforgiving light of justice. For the victims of Mitiga Prison, this trial does not end their pain, but stands as a monumental testament that their suffering was seen, the horrific crimes committed against them were real, and the long, agonizing arc of justice has finally, at last, reached the shores of Libya.